it really gives me great pleasure to introduce him because I've known Ron now for about 4 years. When I first met him, when we started our reenacting out at the George Spangler Farm, and he was a docent there. And then ultimately Ron decided with his journalism background that he was going to write a book about the Spangler Farm. And he was actually kind enough to ask me to review some of the medical things in his manuscript. And I didn't know what to expect. And when that book came out, of course, we read it. It's now become required reading for all of us reenactors, anybody who participates in Spangler. And I had a talk on the medical care at the Battle of Gettysburg, which I would give at Spangler. And I was able to really update that talk, revise it, make it much better after Ron's book came out. And I learned a lot about stuff I didn't know about the organization, actually the Union Medical Department. So for us, the medical people, that book has been really important. And Ron asked if he's been doing lots of roundtables and other presentations, other groups since the book came out, and it's been a bestseller amongst the Civil War community, and rightly so. So Ron Kirkwood retired after a 40-year career as an editor and writer in newspapers and magazines, including USA Today, the Baltimore Sun, Harrisburg's Patriotic News, and the New York Daily Record in Pennsylvania. He also edited magazines for USA Today Sports and was the National Football League editor for USA Today Sports Weekly. He's won numerous state, regional, and national writing and editing awards during his career. When he managed the copy desk at the Patriot News, the newspaper won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012. He's the author of the book we're going to discuss tonight, which was indeed published by Savas Beatty in hardcover. I mentioned the presentation last night with Ted Savas. You know, I talked to him a little bit about Ron. Mr. Kirkwood is a Michigan native and graduate of Central Michigan University, where he returned as guest speaker to journalism classes as part of the school's Hearst Visiting Professional Series. He's served as the Gettysburg Foundation guide. This is where I met him at the George Spangler Farm Civil War Field Hospital since it was opened in 2013. So that's when we met, 2013. He lives in York with his wife, Barbara, of 43 years. Congratulations on that. So without further ado, Ron Kirkwood.
Thank you, John. Let me see if we can get my presentation shared. Oh, okay. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I need to be able to.
You're muted, Paul.
I don't see Paul now. Oh, there is Paul.
Well, Paul's muted though.
I just made Ron the host, so he can do it.
Okay. There we go.
Oh, I love the future. We're part of it. You're doing it, Ron. Very good.
Not quite done.
Yeah, that's it. Good. Now I'm going to mute myself.
I need to.
Yeah, you need the slideshow view.
There we go. Now we've got it.
There's slideshow from the beginning, right?
Yay.
Excellent.
Can everybody see that?
Yes, sir.
All right, good. Thank you. And you can all hear me okay?
Beautiful.
Thank you, District of Columbia. It's great to be here. And John, thank you. What John didn't mention is that when I first started researching the book, he was the first or second person I walked up to when he was a living historian at the farm. And I said, okay, talk to me about Civil War medicine. And he did. He stood there very patiently. He gave me my kindergarten start on Civil War medicine. And then once I advanced and actually wrote the chapter, one chapter is entirely about the medicine. I gave it to John to edit, and he probably prevented a mistake or two by editing it. So John has been there from the beginning to the end in this book, and he's made it better. So thank you, John. I'm excited about the Spangler story, and I'm excited to share it with you folks. I argue in my book that the George Spangler Farm was the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg, so we're going to look at that first. We'll also discuss the Spanglers. We'll discuss the 2 hospitals that were on their farm, and we'll look at the last 3 days of Louis Armistead's life, which he spent at the George Spangler Farm. Now, the map on the left, you can see the Army of the Potomac line, July 2nd, July 3rd. Right behind it in gray is the huge George Spangler Farm, dominating the line, dominating the countryside behind the line. It's huge. It's 166 acres. And look how close it is to that line. It's close to the left flank, it's close to the center, and it's close to the right flank. Then there are the roads. Granite Schoolhouse Lane cuts right through the middle of the farm, and it's marked by the blue arrow. Then there's Blacksmith Shop Road, which also cuts through the farm, marked by the blue X's. Both roads are leading directly to the line, and they connect the Tawnytown Road and the Baltimore Pike, the 2 main arteries. Army of the Potomac commanders saw all of these advantages early on. This farm had the size, it had the location, and it had the roads to put infantry and artillery in reserve on Spangler right behind the line, and then as needed, get those reserves to the line quickly in time to fill holes. This was a farm that could help win a battle. Let me admit this person. Here's the George Spangler Farm, and here's how the Army of the Potomac used it. All of you folks in a meeting like this, in a roundtable like this, in an important club, knows about the 20th Maine, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and the other 5th Corps regiments that rushed to Little Round Top and got there just in time to prevent a Confederate breakthrough. What you folks might not know is from about noon on July 2nd, that corps and the regiments in it spent its afternoon resting on Spangler to the right on the map, on Spangler and on the Boucher and Musser farms. This was right behind the Round Tops on Spangler. So at about 5 o'clock, they got the order, rushed to the line. So the 5th Corps took off, they rushed down Granite Schoolhouse Lane, and they rushed down Blacksmith Shop Road, got to Little Round Top in time, as we all know. They had barely been gone for very long, then the 6th Corps took over the very land that the 5th Corps had been in. But they weren't long before they dashed down Granite Schoolhouse Lane as well to the front. Then later that night on July 2nd, a division of the 12th Corps came off of Culp's Hill up to the top right of the map, and you know where they went, Granite Schoolhouse Lane to the front. General George Meade had his main street, and it was called Granite Schoolhouse Lane through the heart of the George Spangler Farm. Now, we're going to cover the 11th Corps Hospital in detail in a bit. That's number 10 on the map. Now, do you see the 2 spots on the map where the word ambulance is? Those are George Spangler's wheat fields. And when the 11th Corps had 100 ambulances, and when they weren't at Spangler, they were on East Cemetery Hill or they were out on the battlefield, but they spent a lot of time at Spangler. At one point, George said that his 2 wheat fields were white with ambulances. Now, number 9 is the artillery reserve, which we're going to get to in a bit, but accompanying the artillery reserve is the ammunition train. That's 100 wagons of ammunition, and they're supplying the ammunition for all of the artillery in the Army of the Potomac. They brought 24,000 rounds of ammunition with them on July 2nd, and when they left on July 3rd, they only had 4,000 rounds left. And you can imagine how much space 100 wagons and the mules and the men and the equipment, how much room that took up on Spangler. The areas on the map to the west or to the left are more artillery and infantry cavalry bivouacs. Number 4, Granite Schoolhouse. I'll get to that in a bit. And then to the right is Powers Hill. 2/3 of Powers Hill was owned by the Spanglers, and the other third was owned by Nathaniel Leitner, the northern part. So there was artillery up there, there was infantry up there, there was a signal station up on top of Powers Hill, the flags waving. General Slocum, 12th Corps, put his headquarters up on top and at the base of Powers Hill on the 1st, and he stayed there till July 5th. And then General Meade, we all know his headquarters was on the Tawnytown Road until he got bombed out in the cannonade prior to Pickett's charge. So after he left the Tawnytown Road, he retreated to Spangler and Leitner land on the top of Powers Hill. Now, once the battle ended, he left Powers Hill, went out to the battlefield again, but later that night on the 3rd, he came back to Spangler land and he made his headquarters on the Baltimore Pike on the bottom of Powers Hill on George Spangler land. There's a marker there where Slocum's headquarters were, a Slocum headquarters marker, but that's also where Meade was, right on the Baltimore Pike, right at the bottom of the hill. He stayed there till about midday July 4th when the thunderstorms hit and they moved elsewhere inside on the Baltimore Pike. So I
Wow.
got frozen.
Oh, geez.
There we go.
There you go.
That photo shows one artillery battery. That's all of the horses and wagons and men needed to operate 6 cannons, to operate and fire 6 cannons. So that's one artillery battery. There were 19 of those batteries on the George Spangler Farm. They all arrived in the morning and afternoon on July 2nd. There were 7 Union Infantry Corps at Gettysburg, and they all had their own artillery. They, though, had to go where their corps went. The Artillery Reserve were free agents. They worked for the Army, not for a corps. They were the key utility players that you plugged in, and you could count on them to do a great job for you. So that's what Meade and General Hunt did on July 2nd and 3rd. They plugged holes in the line as they developed. The Artillery Reserve left Spangler on July 2nd. They fought at the Peach Orchard. They fought at the Trossel House, Cadore. They fought all along Cemetery Ridge. They fought at Ziegler's Grove, Cemetery Hill, East Cemetery Hill. They even fought on Powers Hill. Most of you folks have probably seen that famous photo at the Trossel Farm of all of the dead horses lying on the ground there next to the barn and the house. Those were 9th Massachusetts battery horses, and they had just been at Spangler. They came out at Spangler from a couple hours earlier, and that's where they died. Other farms saw a lot more combat than the George Spangler Farm in the Battle of Gettysburg and were literally destroyed by it. But no single farm played a greater strategic and logistical role with its 2 roads, with Powers Hill and its middle of it all location than the George Spangler Farm in setting up the Army of the Potomac victory. Now the hospitals. Looks like we're going to have some pauses tonight between slides, so my computer thinks about it.
Damn technology.
There we go. The 1st Division caught the heaviest of the blow. Many killed and wounded were the result, and the latter were now being brought to the hospital in great numbers. Granite Schoolhouse, surgeon in charge, Dr. William Warren Potter, 57th New York. Granite Schoolhouse was built in the early 1860s when the Spanglers donated the land for it in the middle of their farm. On days 2 and 3 of the battle, there was a major 1st Division 2nd Corps Army of the Potomac hospital in the fields and woods around this school. This hospital has received little attention.
Yeah, it's where they built. Okay.
And little has been revealed about it until now, and I think that's a shame. There's not even a sign for it, like there are for so many other division hospitals around Gettysburg. It's just overgrown, unmarked land now with thorns and poison ivy, as shown in the photo at left. If you wanted to find Granite Schoolhouse Hospital these days, it would be tough. If you see that tree, that log that's fallen down, that accidentally marks the location of the Granite Schoolhouse across from the cavalry monument on the other side of the street. This hospital hosted the guys who fought at the Wheatfield, 1st Division 2nd Corps, one of the bloodiest and most well-known places on the battlefield. These were the fighters of the Irish Brigade. This was a division of Father Corby, who granted general absolution to them moments before they went into battle, clearing their path to heaven. This is a division and the Corps of General Hancock. This division lost more than 1,000 men on July 2nd alone. And by the end of that day, of their fighting at the Wheatfield, these guys were either at Granite Schoolhouse in the middle of Spangler, they were waiting to be taken there, or they were prisoners of war. Look at that. Chaplain John Henry Wilbrand Stuckenberg of Erie and the 145th Pennsylvania served at the Granite Schoolhouse. He said, "Our hospital was at the foot of Powers Hill. I found the doctors and nurses busily engaged with the wounded, scattered around in all directions, some lying on blankets, some on straw, a few on stretchers, others on the bare ground. Private Erastus Allen of Company G, shot through the abdomen, suffered terribly. Some of the intestines protruded through the wound, and some of their contents would occasionally flow out, producing a horrible stench. It was very evident that our regiment had again suffered severely." Second Corps Ambulance Chief Lieutenant Thomas Livermore of New Hampshire made numerous deliveries to Granite Schoolhouse on July 2nd. Here under the shelter of some boulders lay a large number of our wounded and dead who had been brought from the field. They lay upon the ground covered with their blankets, and the living were nearly all silent, having fallen asleep from fatigue. They weren't using the schoolhouse building. That was reserved for the Second Corps medical staff. That was the Second Corps headquarters. But all of the fields around it, all that valley leading right up to the base of Powers Hill and the wheat fields next to it, that was the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital. Brigadier General Samuel K. Zook was treated at Granite Schoolhouse after being mortally wounded at the wheat field. When he was laid on the table, the surgeon could see his heart beating through the hole in his chest, determined his wound to be fatal, and they sent him farther behind the line where he died on July 3rd. Again, that monument is on Wheatfield Road, and it marks the general area where General Zook was shot. Colonel Edward E. Cross of New Hampshire was shot on the other side of the wheat field, and he died the night of July 2nd at Granite Schoolhouse. He was beloved in his home state of New Jersey and by many of his fighters, but he also was despised by a few of his fighters because he had a temper and he was a heavy drinker. His Pioneer Corps called him a tyrant and refused to bury him at Gettysburg. Again, the road, Cross Avenue, is between Devil's Den and the wheat field. And that marker down there is the location of where Cross was wounded. Lieutenant General George A. Woodruff of the 1st United States Artillery Battery I was mortally wounded on July 3rd during Pickett's charge. He had his back to the Confederates while facing and directing his men at Ziegler's Grove. The son of a Michigan judge died at Granite Schoolhouse, telling his friends that he regretted being shot in the back and asking that it should be no reflection on his reputation. Most of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital at Granite Schoolhouse was moved to safety farther behind the line on day 3 after 24 hours of intense service because it was getting hit by Confederate artillery overshots from Culp's Hill to the east and the Pickett's Charge cannonade to the west. Granite Schoolhouse hosted an important, huge hospital on Spangler land that took care of the fighters from the wheat field, and this hospital warrants recognition. My hope is that someday the National Park Service cleans up this land, parking is put in nearby, signs are installed, and the foundation of the school is uncovered so visitors can stop, meditate, and honor this place of sacrifice. Now, I've made my thoughts known to the Park Service, and I would love it if any of you folks, and if you share my feelings, let the Park Service know as well. There we go. One day cured me of a hospital. Give me the picket line every time in place of a hospital. Captain Matthew B. Cheney, 154th New York, after visiting the 11th Corps Hospital at the Spangler's Farm. 11th Corps medical staffers picked the Spangler's Farm for a hospital on July 1st because of its proximity to the evolving front line and access to water, crops, and livestock for food, buildings for hospital purposes, good roads, and wood for operating tables, fires, tents, and caskets. While the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital used the school on Spangler land, the 11th Corps Hospital used the Spangler's barn, summer kitchen, house, other outbuildings, and fields. George Spangler was 47 years old during the battle, and Elizabeth was 44. Their children, all of whom were living at home, were 21-year-old Harriet, 19-year-old Sabina, 17-year-old Daniel, and 14-year-old Benaiah. The 6 Spanglers were ordered by the 11th Corps doctors on July 1st to either leave or stay together out of the way in one upstairs bedroom. So that bedroom is where they lived during the 5 weeks and 2 days that their home was a hospital. They could leave the room, but in doing so, they had to step over and around wounded and dying men just to get out of their house. The ambulance corps started delivering 11th Corps and other wounded to Spangler at about 4 p.m. on July 2nd, while the Corps was fighting north of town and in town. At its peak, on July 4th and 5th, the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission both estimated that there were about 1,900 wounded at this hospital. And of those 1,900, between 50 and 100 were Confederates. Dr. Daniel G. Brinton of Westchester, Pennsylvania said, "The wounded soon began to pour in, giving us such sufficient occupation that from the 1st of July till the afternoon of the 5th, I was not absent from the hospital more than once, and then but for an hour or two. Very hard work it was too, and little sleep fell to our share. 4 operating tables were going night and day. Many of them were hurt in the most shocking manner by shells. My experience at Chancellorsville was nothing compared to this, and I never wish to see such another sight. For myself, I think I never was more exhausted." Surgeries and amputations took place under the forebay right there of the Spangler's barn. There, doctors could have more light and fresh air away from the smells and crowds inside the barn. 4 surgeons worked under the forebay with their backs to the wall of the barn. A surgeon would finish one amputation or operation in 5 to 15 minutes and then move immediately to the next one. No washing required of bloody or germ-infested hands or bloody equipment because they didn't understand how proper sanitation could prevent infection and reduce the spread of disease. Sometimes a Spangler surgeon with germ-covered hands would infect a soldier with a disease. A Spangler surgeon approaching total exhaustion called the work too much for human endurance. Private William Southerton, age 19, 75th Ohio, said, "At the doorway, I saw a huge stack of amputated arms and legs, a stack as high as my head. The most horrible thing I ever saw in my life. I wish I had never seen it. I sickened." Amputated limbs were eventually loaded into a wagon and buried somewhere on the Spangler's property. The amputations and surgeries and wounds attracted an infestation of flies that relentlessly harassed everyone. Pigeons in the barn added to the filth, and hornets added to the pain. Then there were the maggots that covered wounds and stumps. Infections were expected after a Civil War surgery, and the worst infections could be smelled 8 to 10 feet away. So you can imagine the stench that greeted a hospital staffer or visitor in the barn, or when entering a tent filled with 8 to 10 men, all suffering with infections. To help battle these smells, Spangler hospital workers cut branches off pine trees and hung them on the tents and used them for bedding.
What happened?
There we go. Each change of slide is a victory tonight. You folks probably all know these Pennsylvania bank barns. That's what the Spanglers had. The bank on the back, the forebay on the front. The posts that you see were added by the foundation when they rehabbed the barn 3 years ago, just to hold the forebay up. These type barns were brought over by the Swiss and the Germans in the 1700s and 1800s. You can see them all over the battlefield. They're all over South Central Pennsylvania, up to Harrisburg, up to Allentown. York County has a lot of these, Adams County, Franklin County, and I even know there's some in Maryland.
There are.
Yeah. Men were crammed so closely together in the Spangler's barn that it caused the spread of diseases. Some men died of these diseases rather than the battle wound that brought them to the hospital. All of this hospital was horrific. All of this barn was horrific, but it was the worst under the forebay where the amputations took place and just inside that front wall, inside in the stable. That's where the worst cases awaited their surgery amid cries of agony and smells of infection, body fluids, and human feces. Cries and screams could be heard 50 yards away in the Spangler's house. Hospital workers covered their head with a pillow at night to try to drown out the sounds. A chaplain walked through the stable, picking his way through the men and reading scripture and praying with them and attempting to help send them on their way. Outside in the Spangler fields, the Army didn't provide enough tents or bedding, food, or clothes for the first several days, multiplying the misery of the wounded and dying men who were forced to lie in the mud in the open when the thunderstorms came. Corporal William R. Kiefer, 153rd Pennsylvania hospital steward, said, hundreds were lying with but feeble or in most cases with no shelter, exposed to a cold incessant rain against the sides of the barn and in an orchard adjoining the sheds. Their moans were heard in every direction, and with a lantern I moved about from one to another during the long hours of the night. I searched in vain for blankets to cover the suffering and dying. Two female nurses played key roles at Spangler. Marilla Hovey and her 17-year-old son Frank traveled with her husband, Dr. Bleecker Lansing Hovey of the 136th New York. She was always one of the first ones to reach a hospital during a battle, but unfortunately, we don't have any photos of Mrs. Hovey. The Hoveys are the only surgeon's family known to have traveled together during the entire Civil War. She nursed the wounded and wrote home to family members of the dead and dying. She worked in the stable a lot, and she was able to go into sort of an autopilot mode and look past their terrible wounds and their suffering and hold the hands of dying soldiers and talk to them in a desperate attempt to get their mind off their agony and situation. In one letter from Spangler, Mrs. Hovey informed the family of their son's death and told them, I have had a great deal of care of him and called him my soldier boy and tried to take the place of mother, sister, and friend. I think I never had such a trial, parting with one that I had no more acquaintance with. The Hoveys worked at the 11th Corps Hospital the entire 5 weeks it was open. Then they went home to New York for 3 weeks to recover. Nurse Rebecca Lane Pennypacker Price of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, rode to Gettysburg on a bench in a railroad cattle car in the middle of the night with donations shortly after the battle, then went to work as an unpaid nurse at Spangler. She said, the sad scenes would fill a volume. So many times at night, I lay on my stretcher weeping instead of sleeping. Captain Augustus Vignos, 107th Ohio, was wounded on July 1st on what is now Barlow Knoll. Gangrene developed and his right arm was amputated above the elbow at Spangler. Mrs. Price nursed him from near death until he was well enough to take a train home to Canton, Ohio. He went on to marry in 1866, have 9 children, many grandchildren, and amassing substantial wealth as a businessman. He was a pallbearer at the funeral of close friend William McKinley. Vignos carried Mrs. Price's photo for 40 years after the war. He often showed her photo to fellow ex-soldiers at national encampments in an attempt to find her and thank her, but without luck. Finally, in 1906, he received a letter from her. Dear sir, do you remember the tall nurse at Gettysburg who furnished you with clothing so that you could go home? She had found him. Vignos replied that he looked forward to seeing her with great pleasure, and their reunion took place at a GAR encampment in New York State in 1906, 43 years after they met at the Spangler's farm. This happens to be my wife, Barb. She did a lot of the research with me, and we spent a week up at Cornell University going through 19 of these filthy, horrible boxes, looking for information on the 154th New York, because they had patients at Spangler and they had medical staff at Spangler. These boxes were so filthy of 1800s dirt and grime and falling apart paper that we were just covered in it when we went home or when we went back to the hotel each day. And it turned out to be so bad that Cornell has now closed down these boxes and they're calling them environmental hazard and nobody can access them. So I was lucky in that aspect that we were able to go through them, and I was doubly lucky because not only did we find a lot about the 154th New York, but so many of those guys were at Spangler when General Armistead arrived that I got a lot of comments and a lot of insight on Armistead that had never been published before. So despite the filth, it was a good trip to Cornell. Armistead lingered through the 4th and died on the 5th, leaving an example of patriotism, heroism, and devotion to duty, which ought to be handed down through the generations. Colonel Raleigh Martin, 53rd Virginia. Armistead began the final walk of his life in what would become known as Pickett's Charge on the Seminary Ridge farm of Henry Spangler. He would die 2 days later on the farm of Henry's half-brother, George. Armistead arrived at George and Elizabeth Spangler's farm at dusk on July 3rd, 1863, according to Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York. And again, this is one of the many things I got in those boxes up at Cornell. Armistead arrived in an ambulance. He was removed on a stretcher and placed on the ground next to the ambulance near the Spangler's barn. 11th Corps Hospital Workers Private Emery Sweetland and Private Edson Ames of the 154th described Armistead's appearance as pretty bloody and covered with blood. Sweetland heard Armistead as he lay on a stretcher say, "You have a man here that is not afraid to die." The Spangler's property was a shoulder-to-shoulder mass of confusion, agony, and crying when Armistead arrived. Hundreds of wounded men from Pickett's Charge were pouring in as overwhelmed surgeons desperately tried to find who could be saved with immediate attention. Even so, the arrival of the Confederate general turned heads. Hospital staffers and most wounded had no idea of Armistead's historic courage that day, but still a large crowd of workers and gawkers formed around his stretcher, circling Armistead. The crowd was eventually broken up when Dr. Van Arnhem arrived at Armistead's side and ordered that he be carried away for treatment. Fellow Spangler patient, First Lieutenant T.C. Holland, 28th Virginia, said he and Armistead were placed in the orchard. Lieutenant Holland said at one point under the trees that Armistead asked the doctors and nurses working around him to, "Please don't step so close to me." Dr. Van Arnhem described Armistead as wild, nervous, flighty, saying war must cease, men of same blood, and he could not live. Spangler patient, Private Justice Silliman, 17th Connecticut, described the 46-year-old Armistead as rather past middle age. Private Sweetland, Armistead had gray hair and whiskers. Dr. J. Kling, 55th Ohio, said Armistead was suffering intense pain induced by the wound. Stimulant and painkillers were immediately given him. Dr. Britton took time to get to know Armistead, calling him a fine man, intelligent and refined. He said, I had considerable conversation with him and was much pleased with his manners and language. Armistead died July 5th in the summer kitchen, a separate building shown to the right of the Spangler's house in that photo. Army of the Potomac Captain Frederick Stowe, the son of author Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame, was his roommate in the building, which was reserved for VIPs. Stowe lived. Armistead was wrapped in a blanket and placed in a coffin made of wood from the Spangler's farm and buried in their orchard. 1 month later, he was exhumed by an embalmer seeking to make money off his body. So Armistead was dug up after a month in a wood coffin. His body was embalmed in whatever condition it was in, and then it was reburied. His body was dug up one more time in October when his family claimed him and reburied him in Baltimore. Now, I have found, confirmed, and listed the names, wound, and treatment of 1,435 Union and Confederate men at the Spangler 11 Corps Hospital, and the names of almost 140 men who were buried in the Spangler's peach and apple orchards. The Union men were exhumed within a few months after the battle and reburied in Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg. Most Confederates, other than Armistead, lay in Gettysburg until 1872, when they were exhumed and reburied across the South. Armistead is one of 5 Confederates known to have been buried at Spangler. "50-year-old Colonel Eliakim Sherrill of the 126th New York died in the Spangler's house. His funeral in Geneva, New York, drew lines several blocks long. His image is on that monument to the 126th New York at Ziegler's Grove. Assistant Surgeon William S. Moore was the only doctor who died in Gettysburg. He died at Spangler. He left behind a 1-year-old and 2-year-old children and young wife Sarah, who mourned for the rest of her life and never remarried. Colonel Francis Mahler, 75th Pennsylvania, also died in the Spangler's house. Philadelphia City Council honored him with a resolution and paid for his funeral. His brother, 2nd Lieutenant Lewis, died on the battlefield on July 1st at about the time and place of his brother's mortal wounding. Sergeant Nelson W. Jones of the 3rd Maine died at Spangler after being hit in both legs in the peach orchard by a cannonball. He died even though he made and applied tourniquets by himself on the battlefield. He was 20 or 21 years old. Private George Nixon of the 73rd Ohio died at Spangler. He would become the great-grandfather of President Richard M. Nixon. George was 40 years old when he entered the Army as a poor man working on a farm that he rented. He left behind a wife and 9 children when he went off to war, probably only enlisting to make money to support his family. Adjutant and First Lieutenant Joseph Heaney, age 21, of the 157th New York, died of a leg wound at Spangler. Nurse Price walked next to his stretcher and held an umbrella over him to protect him from the July sun as he was taken to the Spangler barn for an amputation. First Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler, 75th Ohio, age 25, spent almost a month at Spangler before he died of wounds in his right side, right leg, left groin, and left arm. His parents were at his side, and Nurse Price sang Rock of Ages to him as he died. This is Sergeant Henry Seas of the 82nd Ohio, and he wrote this letter to his brother from Spangler. My leg was amputated just above the knee. I stood the operation very well, being under the influence of chloroform. I am very well cared for and in a fair way to get along well. I hope Mother will not worry herself about me. Sergeant Seas died a week after he wrote that letter home. One soldier died at Spangler one day before his grief-stricken father reached his side. Another died a few days before his wife reached Spangler. Family members obviously found out about their loved one's death when they arrived. Many died at the 11th Corps Hospital, who were the lone source of income for their sickly parents back home. Many died at Spangler as teenagers. But the vast majority of 11th Corps Hospital patients survived, including Captain Alfred E. Lee, 82nd Ohio hip wound, went home to Ohio, picked up the town newspaper when he arrived, found his obituary in the newspaper, saw his funeral was going on, so then he walked in on his funeral. Brigadier General Francis Barlow spent a week at Spangler with 3 wounds that numerous doctors declared to be mortal, but he surprised all of them and lived. It is thought that his wife Arabella attended him at Spangler. Corporal James Brownlee of the 134th New York survived 7 gunshot wounds at the Brickyard on July 1st, one of which broke 4 ribs. He also was shot 3 times through the bowels and in the left thigh, right thigh, and lower back. If you combine the number of wounded at Granite Schoolhouse with the number of wounded at the 11th Corps Hospital in and around the Spangler's barn, then the Spanglers hosted between 2,500 and 3,000 wounded soldiers on their property, more than the entire population of Gettysburg of 2,400 at the time.
Come on.
Well, the surgeons at Spangler were among the best of the best for their time, and they saved far more lives than they lost. And just like the soldiers, these surgeons were taken prisoner, they were wounded, they got sick, and they suffered and sacrificed greatly. Many Spangler surgeons were in their 30s and 40s when they died because of their exposure to disease, their horrifying work, poor food, long marches, and unsanitary camp life. I dug up in my research the names of 15 head surgeons who worked at the 11th Corps Hospital, and most of them went on to leadership roles in medicine in their community after the war. These guys are 3 of my favorites. Dr. Henry Van Arnhem, 154th New York, was a passionate opponent of slavery who wanted full civil rights for blacks. He said, "The curse of God visits on all that come in contact with this atrocious institution." Dr. Van Arnhem served 4 terms as a United States Congressman. Unknown to Dr. Van Arnhem, his nephew and namesake, 22-year-old Captain Henry Van Arnhem Fuller of the 64th New York, was killed July 2nd at Gettysburg, while Dr. Van Arnhem worked nearby at Spangler. Dr. Van Arnhem constantly told his wife in letters home how much he loved her and how much he missed her. Dr. Henry K. Neff, 153rd Pennsylvania, was captured at Chancellorsville and held prisoner for 4 weeks, and his health never recovered. He was sick as he cared for others at Spangler, and he remained sick after he was transferred to work at Camp Letterman later in July. He died not long after the war at age 45. Spangler surgeon Dr. J. Kling, 55th Ohio, was captured by Confederate cavalry while on his way home after being mustered out in Georgia in 1864 and imprisoned for 3 months. He filed a claim to the government for losses sustained and expenses incurred, but was denied because he was taken prisoner after he was mustered out. The 11th Corps wounded continued to be sent away until finally on August 7th, Spanglers had their farm back, at least what was left of it. George filed 3 damage claims to the state and federal governments totaling about $5,000, but they received only $90, and it's believed that the entire $90 went to their Washington, D.C. attorney, so they got nothing. The U.S. quartermaster's agent said in denying their claims, "The government of the United States is no more responsible for bringing on the battle fought there than it would have been had a tornado passed over that country, causing as widespread destruction as did that terrible engagement. That battle and hospital damage was his misfortune." These are the 2 known photos of immediate George Spangler family members, and the one on the top has received a lot of play. That's Benaiah, the youngest son, in the middle. That's his wife, Sarah, and then their daughter, Mary Elizabeth. And it's believed that William Tipton took this photo in 1888 on the 25th anniversary of the battle. Benaiah was living on the farm and farming it after his parents bought the Musser farm next door and moved there. But mom and dad still owned the farm and paid the taxes on it. But you can see in 1888 how the farm developed. If you can see on the house, the porch there on the house, everything to the left of the porch was added before 1870. So the Spanglers did okay bouncing back from their damage. In front of the house, you can see the white smokehouse for the smoking of their meats. If you come back closer to us outside the picket fence, you can see the outhouse. On the picket fence, they always put the nicest fences up close around the yard and the close buildings. The summer kitchen is there to the right of the house, and that's a grape arbor on the front of it. The grape arbors were important back then, not only for the grapes, but for the shade. They did a lot of their chores under the shade of the grape arbor. And you can see the oven for baking bread sticking out on this side of the summer kitchen. The building, the schoolhouse, bottom right. This photo was taken probably in 86 or 87. Benaiah Spangler, that's again him. He's on the very left of the photo under the X, looking like he just walked off the set of Fiddler on the Roof. Benaiah is in the photo because he was on the Cumberland Township School Board. I guess she's probably blocked. Just under the photos on the right of us is his daughter, Mary Elizabeth, again. Under the blue arrow is Clara Patterson, and the blue oval is Alice Patterson. They're daughters of Sabina, George's second child, who married Patterson. So he had 3 grandkids going to this school. You can't see her because she's covered up to the right, but the teacher is Maggie Schwartz, and she's actually holding a ruler. And down by the dog, the little boy with the dog, that's little Raphael Sherfy of the Peach Orchard family fame.
Yeah.
Raphael's dad was also Raphael, but he was dead by this point. Despite that, despite his disadvantages, little Raphael grew up to become a dentist. George Spangler was chairman of the Cumberland Township School Board when he donated the land for Granite Schoolhouse to be built on his property in 1861. So you can see Benaiah followed in his dad's footsteps to being on the school board. And then George's dad, Abraham, also served on the Cumberland Township School Board. George also was a church and Adams County leader, serving on several boards, and he was on the Evergreen Cemetery Board when they voted not to allow any Confederates to be buried there at the time. A teacher whom George hired said, "Mr. Spangler proved himself to be a very efficient school official and made a lasting impression on my mind as a man of truthfulness and honesty in all things, and I lived to see my belief demonstrated time and again." Elizabeth Spangler took care of her widower father in his later years, and made sure he was buried next to her and George. The Spanglers also took in a niece after George's sister Susanna died in 1863. All 4 Spangler children became productive adults. Harriet and Sabina married local farmers and had families. Daniel moved to Kansas to use his carpentry skills in the growing new state and settled near Abilene around the time that Wild Bill Hickok served as marshal there in the early 1870s. Benaiah worked the family farm for many years until he gave up farming and moved into Gettysburg. As was common in those days, personal tragedy followed the Spanglers. George's daughter, Harriet, died 2 months after he died, and Harriet's daughter, Annie, died a few days after her mother. So Elizabeth Spangler lost her husband, a daughter, and a granddaughter in a little more than 2 months. Also, one of Daniel's 2 sons drowned in Kansas, and Benaiah's only grandchild died as a toddler. As Doc Willen knows very well from being there so often and serving so many people there, after an almost complete rebuild since purchasing the property in 2008, the Gettysburg Foundation now opens the farm to visitors and offers programs and tours on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays in June, July, and early August, and battle anniversary days on July 1st and 3rd. Well, that opening has been delayed this year because of the coronavirus. Adams County has gone green. I just got a hint that the farm still would not be open this weekend, that they're maybe thinking about the following weekend. So check the Gettysburg Foundation website. Check the George Spangler Farm Facebook group. Again, Doc Willen is in the George Spangler Farm Facebook group, and you can get more information. And by the way, most of the wood in that rebuilt barn that looks so nice down at the bottom right, that wood was there in 1863 and is the same wood that the men lay on and lay next to. Finally, if a sadder task can be found on this earth than that of searching through field hospitals after a battle, I know not what it is. Those huge Pennsylvania barns covered with the mangled bodies of men, thick as they could lie, many among them destined never to see the light of another day, presented a spectacle that time cannot efface from the memory of those whom duty called to witness the saddest of mortal sights. Captain James F. Huntington, Artillery Reserve. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. I have one more slide to show. If the books are starting to reopen, the bookstores are starting to reopen. Gettysburg Heritage Center, Civil War and More in Mechanicsburg, but everything else that carries my book is still closed. You can buy it directly from me at a good price, lower than Amazon, if you email me. And you can also buy it online at the publisher Savas Beatty for a 20% discount. So those are your options for buying the book. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I just want to say a couple things before we open it up. You guys hearing me?
I hear you.
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, first of all, thank you, Ron. That was great. And there's a couple things that you didn't get to that are in the book that I think are interesting. One, I'm glad you mentioned Vignow because I'm from Canton, Ohio, and so I knew his story. But you mentioned Dr. Hovey and his wife. There actually is a colleague of mine who's a reenactor named Rex Hovey, who's I think a great grandnephew of Dr. Hovey. And he reenacts at Spangler, and he has his instruments actually.
Yeah.
He has Dr. Hovey's instruments, and he's apparently brought them there. And you know, everyone always wondered why Armistead died so quickly when Dr. Brinton and others who initially examined him thought that he only had a couple of mild wounds, I think in the arm and the thigh. Well, apparently Dr. Van Arsden and Dr. Hovey said that he had a chest wound, and that's actually why he died. Yeah. And the Park Service hasn't changed their interpretation or anything, but Rex says it's a family story, you know, and that Dr. Brinton they didn't initially take his uniform off, and that they found that this chest wound. So may explain. And the other thing about Granite Schoolhouse, which is sort of ironic, is I believe it was the first place General Hancock was brought, and therefore both Hancock and Armistead were on Spangler property.
Yes, only a quarter of a mile apart.
Yeah,
so close. It's actually painful to think they were so close that they could have got together. Maybe that would have helped Armistead survive. I don't know. They were probably both taken off the field at about the same time because Hancock had to wait for an ambulance and he wanted to issue orders. Armistead had to wait for an ambulance. All the ambulances were out running. So.
And Jackie Greer, who's my nurse at Spangler, and we've found that spot in the grass. You're right; it's in a bad place.
Yeah, you can find a bunch of rocks and kind of measure it out to be the foundation, but I think the Park Service could really do it.
I wish they would. Now the Park Service, by the way, has rehabilitated besides the barn, the farmhouse, which is now a state-of-the-art meeting center, communications. They didn't restore it to the way it was in 1863. They restored it as a modern conference center, officers for the foundation and so forth, and even has an indoor bathroom so the reenactors can use an indoor bathroom. So.
Yeah, and I have a picture of it now that I'm going to show in just a second, and I actually argued for them. The Pry House at Antietam has a great medical museum, and there's enough information now that this book is out that they could have made the first floor of that house a museum and given something else for visitors to go through. But they chose to make it a conference center on the first floor and offices on the second floor. And when they put offices in a conference center in, they had to take the driveway all the way up to the summer kitchen. So all that historic land is now under a gravel.
Yeah,
driveway.
there's gravel there and everything.
Yeah,
And the other thing, there's supposed to be a walking trail, apparently.
Yeah, that's not done yet. They're still working on that.
From the visitor center to Spangler.
Yeah, and they're going to take it now down to Tawny Town Road because they had water issues on the Powers Hill route.
And our group has, because we have older members, we have decided not to go this summer. I don't know if Paul has made a decision, the site manager, to what he's going to do. I may go if on my own if he does open it up, though.
Yeah, I don't even think they're going to do bus runs out there this year.
Yeah, so it probably is kaput for this season. It's too bad, like everything else. Now, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, Ron, thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation. It was very good. And now I know why Stan always said he never wanted to have John speak at our dinners. It's pretty bloody, but maybe we can have John speak instead of Clemmer, because maybe it's more agreeable when it's just on a Zoom presentation. But I had two questions for you. Mick Bedard said that the union started with only 98 doctors in service, and then it grew to 10,000. I don't know what it was like for the Confederate side, but there were a lot of doctors there. I just was wondering if you knew whether that was accurate and what the comparison was with the Confederacy. And then the other question.
10 and 11,000 number was over the course of the entire war.
I've seen the number 12,005. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
At Gettysburg, the Army of the Potomac had, I have it here somewhere, it's like 600.
605.
Yeah. But then when the Army left town on July 5th, there were only about 100 left. So they had all these surgeries going on the 5th and the 6th and the 7th, and they went from 600 and some surgeons to 100 surgeons.
Well, no, the Union, the Union left behind around 300. The Confederates left behind about 100, but it was markedly reduced. The number that we give is 12,500 for the Union, unknown for the Confederates, at least 5,000 probably surgeons.
The number I got from the museum, the Civil War Museum of Medicine, was 106 Union soldiers were left behind and 40 Confederate were left behind.
No, that's not right. I mean, you know,
You mean doctors?
No, there were way more doctors left behind than that. The Confederates themselves left behind around 100. They left proportionally more. They had 10. They had at least 10 went to prison at Fort McHenry, actually.
Well, I was just shocked at how few there were at the beginning of the war and how
That's totally right.
Yeah, the other question I had was, you talked about how bodies were exhumed from the Spangler Farm after the war, but did they also exhume the limbs? And would there be, if they're still there, is there a way to get any sort of DNA to trace them? You know, to who was there, if there was any ability to garner any research from any limbs that might have been left behind?
The Gettysburg Foundation has done very limited study on that. They did some out in the orchard before they planted the trees there to make sure there weren't any bodies or limbs buried out there, and they found nothing out in the orchard where the cemetery was. I don't know what their plans are as far as looking for the limbs. I, for some reason, envision them between the house and the road on the east side of the house out in that field, because the wind blows west to east usually, and those fields were soft. I don't know.
Would there be any way to research value if they did find limbs? Is there any way to
I would think so.
collect DNA to be able to determine?
Especially because they know, well, at least from what I've come up with, we know what Confederates were there. So I would think they could match it up. I just don't know if they're planning on, they've never mentioned since I've been out there in 2013 that they're interested in finding those limbs. The
Ron,
Spanglers knew where they were, but nobody else today knows.
Ron, would you mind sending me back the control of the screen so I can unmute everybody? Click on my right corner and send the control of the screen back over. So it's the screen sharing part to me, so I can unmute everybody. And anybody that wants to unmute, go ahead and unmute yourselves.
Now, is that, I guess just as a follow-up, isn't there National Historic Preservation Act requirements to do something with that?
I don't know. You know, the National Park Service has archaeologist, someone who specializes in archaeology. I can't think of his name at the moment, but he would be the right person. Like if they have mentioned talking about doing some digging behind Granite Schoolhouse, so he is always a person involved in something like that. So you or we could look him up and ask that very important question. Where are they? They have a whole 80 acres to look for them. I don't know how long that would take, but it seems kind of important.
All right.
I would love to know.
My last question was I the only one struck about how George Nixon looked like President Nixon?
Really?
There is some resemblance there.
All participants are now unmuted.
You know, when Nixon was the vice president, I don't know if when he was president too, he paid somebody to put fresh flowers on that grave every week.
And he visited the grave too.
Yeah.
Ron, it's Bill Benzel. I have a question for you, and that is from your slides, it looks as if the farm was in private hands for a number of years, and it was a relatively recent acquisition by the National Park Service. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It was in private hands. The Spanglers sold it in 1908, I think it was. And then the foundation, Gettysburg Foundation, purchased it in 2008. And it sat there for a while, and they just let it sit, and they made sure the electricity didn't electrocute anybody, made sure the barn would stand up. And in 2013, they rebuilt it a little bit, enough for the public to be able to visit. And by 2016, they had it, the barn, the summer kitchen, the smokehouse, all that was done. And then last year, the last thing was the house. And they turned that into a conference center and offices with a $1 million contribution from Tinsley Construction. I can show you a picture if I get the PowerPoint back on, a beautiful picture of what the farm looks like today.
Yeah, it's the same construction company that did the new visitor center there.
Paul, can I get back to the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I just sent you host.
Okay.
Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I sent it to the wrong person. Sorry, Ron. Sorry. Okay.
By the way, Rich, I like your background.
I was wondering if we can get signed books from you when we send a email to you.
Yeah, if you email me, signed books, discounted, including packaging and shipping. No, I still can't get it. There's a nice new photo. I would really love it if I could show it to you folks. I know John has probably seen it.
Well, I was there for when they had the ribbon cutting for the farmhouse, because I'm a donor for that project.
No. Paul, can I get?
I'm working on it, sir.
Okay.
It's really the foundation and not the Park Service. It's on Park Service land, but there's even been some friction between the Park Service and the foundation. They used to send rangers out there the first year to do programs, and they pulled back, they cut that. So now the docents in the foundation have to do all the programs. They even did an artillery demonstration when the Park Service was there because of the fact that it was the artillery reserve.
Mary Ellen King, I accidentally put you as host. I instead of Ron Kirk, but it was a boo-boo. Please send it back, Mary Ellen King.
Hi, Carolyn.
Okay, so how do I do that?
Pardon?
Right, top right, click on me.
Yep.
And go to participants.
Then you get to really see what the farm looks like today.
Yeah, I was there also when it looked like the first picture he showed when it was falling down. It was horrible.
Volunteers were involved then. Volunteers put
Absolutely.
siding on that.
Hey, Sasha, is that you from,
Okay, you should have it.
Yep,
it's beautiful.
that's my hometown.
Paul,
Yes.
you should have control.
No, I do not yet.
Oh.
All right, hold on. Oh, different Paul. I'm Paul Mazuki. You sent it to a different Paul.
Okay, well, now we've got another issue.
Sorry, Paul. Send it to Jon Willen, Paul.
Uh-oh. Which Paul is that?
This is, it's not me. I'm Paul Mazuka. Sorry. This is
Yeah,
a company.
who's the other Paul?
That's Paul Severance. Am I supposed to have this?
Yeah, so. You need,
Go to screen sharing and send it to Jon Willen, please. Or send it to me.
Ron Kirkwood, you mean?
Kirkwood. Sorry. Okay.
Still not there.
Thank you for your help.
I see Steve Jaron missed my my accolade for doing all the educational stuff. Did you start late, Steve? You missed
Oh,
that?
Steve here. I didn't see Steve earlier.
Yeah, no, I did
Oh,
start.
there he is. He's
I wasn't paying attention to the times in the message. I was thinking 7 o'clock.
he's only a figure though.
Still waiting.
I know that Paul has not sent the host yet.
Yeah, and David Hilliard, you also missed our comment about how helpful you were in getting the audio recordings together.
Oh, Carolyn's there. Carolyn has spent a
Okay,
lot of time at Spangler.
Well,
Hi, Jen. How are you?
Hi,
Hi,
Carolyn.
Ron. How are you?
Hi, Carolyn. Good to see you.
Hello.
I'll
Great
let you-
program, by the way.
Pardon me?
Great program. As
Oh,
usual.
thanks. Are you home in Connecticut?
Well, we're in Gettysburg.
Are you?
Ron Kirkwood, you're now the host.
Yay. All right, here comes that photo, I think.
Hey, David.
There we go.
There.
Oh, wow.
What do you think, folks?
Wow.
Beautiful.
George would be proud of it.
Wow.
Neater than it was in 1860s.
Wow, that looks like it was painted. That's an actual drone shot or something?
It is. It's a drone. It's 80 acres there now. It was 166 acres when the Spanglers owned it. And all those trees in the back that you see, all those beautiful trees, they weren't there. A lot fewer trees were there in 1863. But the cemetery was here down in the left-hand corner. That was their orchard. And you can see the left of the house that they added on back before 1870. Again, conference room, bottom floor, offices, top floor, bathrooms, etc. behind it.
Now,
But I don't think visitors on weekends are going to be able to go into the house. So it's just going to be the smokehouse, the summer kitchen.
Right.
barn.
There's nothing in there for visitors. Yeah.
now, what's the angle we're looking at? Is that south?
We're on the south east of it. The battlefield is on the other side of the trees, and the visitor center is up above top right. that
Yeah,
direction.
yeah. Not only is the battlefield, it's Cemetery Ridge, and so that barn had to be evacuated during the cannonade because the shells were where they're overshooting were landing in the Spangler Farm.
Wow.
Yeah, the wounded remained in the barn though.
I thought they
The
took some
wounded
of them out.
Couldn't move.
The ones who
stayed.
could.
Yeah.
They took some of them out of the barn because of the overshots. They did. They carried them farther away. I have a bit on that in the book. Now, if the foundation really wanted to have this accurate, they would put a grape arbor back on the summer kitchen because a grape arbor was important to the Spanglers.
But Ron,
There's
this is
even-
Mary Ellen. I have a question.
Hi, Mary
Go for
Ellen.
Hey, so definitely Armistead died in the summer kitchen?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I think it was pretty definite because Benaiah said he died in the kitchen and they didn't have a kitchen as such in the house. The
Right,
kitchen was in the
okay.
summer kitchen. So that's, and Dr. Kling made reference to something like that too, the outbuilding, and one other doctor did too. So I'm pretty confident
Okay, cool.
that he died in a summer kitchen.
And Stowe was in there with him, huh?
Yeah, Frederick Stowe.
He
Okay.
got hit.
And then
Fred-
Barlow arrived on the 5th, and he would have been carried right past the summer kitchen into the house. So you had the two generals right in that compound together.
Okay.
Fred Stowe got hit in the head with a cannonball
Yeah, on Cemetery Hill.
right in his ear.
Yeah, and he sailed to San Francisco in 1870, and his parents never heard from him again.
Yeah, he was an alcoholic.
How many people would fit in that kitchen and in the house?
Well, in the kitchen, they only had two. Once Fred Stowe was shipped out on about July 15th, they used it again for an actual kitchen and for baking bread. In the house, they had 3 colonels in the house, and they had Barlow in the house, and they had the family in one upstairs bedroom. So they were crammed in there. Although Cheryl and Mahler both died early on, so they wouldn't have been in there very long.
Yeah, and didn't the other Spangler from the Emmitsburg Road, he came over and got in the house with them too?
So you know who that was? That was Jacob Hummelbaugh.
Oh, Hummelbaugh, that's
Yeah,
right.
he was a
The guy
widower.
where Barksdale died.
Yes. Hummelbaugh was a widower.
That's
and
right.
for a couple of nights, he came and stayed in that same bedroom. They had 7 in that bedroom during the battle. Hummelbaugh and his wife actually ended up being buried. They were such good friends with the Spanglers that they're buried right next to them in Evergreen Cemetery.
Oh, yeah, and his farm is where Barksdale died.
Yes. Any other thoughts on this picture? I might even show you one more before we wrap it up. Any other questions? All right, I give talks to 5th graders every year, and I always want to show them what a Civil War surgeon looks like. And when they see this picture, they kind of react with horror. It's
Well, what's really funny about that is I actually do a program every year for 5th graders here in Washington, and I come with that.
It's a great effect. I love watching their faces, their mouths open when I put this picture on the screen.
Well,
Thank
yeah.
you for contributing to my presentations.
Well, a friend of mine wrote a book about the 24th Virginia surgeons that we used to reenact, and he put that picture on the cover.
It's a great shot.
Is there a way to unsee that now?
It's stuck in your head now.
In actuality, it would have been worse.
Hey, Ron, it's Mary Ellen. I have another question.
Okay.
So the chaplain who was stealing goods, did you ever get a name on him?
The chaplain that was what?
Stealing the supplies and taking all the
I
goodies?
have
It's in the book.
I have a very good idea who it was, but I am not going to say it because I'm not 100%. But there are hints in the book.
Okay,
There are hints
okay.
who it was.
Take care of your dishes?
Yeah.
Pardon me?
You can do my dishes.
You know, it was Price who exposed him, right? The nurse.
Yes. Yes. He was a minister, and he lived close to the Spanglers, and she complained about him. She said the French chaplain.
The French chaplain, yes.
So if you take those 3 hints, you
Got it.
you should be able to figure it out. But I never said it. I'm not sure. That's just who I
Okay.
think.
Okay, I'm just curious because,
Mary Ellen, by the way, was a big help in getting Nurse Price information to me. Her and George Rapp, her descendant. Mary Ellen has done a lot of study on that and on women. So thank you, Mary Ellen.
you're welcome.
Can we take that picture down now?
Yeah. Thank you.
That was a little mean, I guess.
Uh,
Any other questions?
It just looked like Jon Willen, that's all.
My wife doesn't
Just
like
one
that
for a while and
picture
forget about
either.
Excellent, Ron. Thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks for having
Yeah,
me.
that was
Ron.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We always remind people that we are still open to have your memberships renewed because we will be continuing on with Zoom meetings as long as necessary. Fergus is the speaker next month, right? Right, Kurt?
Right.
Excellent.
We usually do not have a meeting in July or August, but since this is an
Your host, Paul.
we are going to have Fergus Bordewick speak on his book, Congress at War. Gordon Berg did a nice review that's posted on our website about it. And Fergus is excited. He's a member, of course, and he's given talks in the past, and he's very animated and very good historian.
Very good. And so we'll keep at it until hopefully we are back to our live meetings, and we'll see what plays out with the opening of Fort McNair.
Right. And Fort McNair possibly. As Paul
Yeah,
said.
that's what I'm saying. If they do reopen, then maybe we can move back there.
This will be
I'll
recorded.
keep you posted.
Thank you, Ron.
Yes, once again, thank you, Ron, and also thank you everyone who attended. We really appreciate it. We ended up with over 30, so that's good.
40. Yep.
40, great.
42.
46 at one point.
46.
Yeah,
Bye,
and
all. Thank
Yeah.
you.
that's more than we normally would get at a live
Thank you
meeting,
very
except
much.
for the combined. So
And you
that's
had
good.
it. You got your bloody presentation in.
Yeah.
I ate two hamburgers, medium rare, while he was talking.
Blood dripping from your.
just like
You should
Grant.
have forewarned me.
You should have had them well done like Grant.
No, they were medium rare. Have a good month. We'll see
And
you.
we got people from all over, like Sash, to join us, who's moved out of the
Take
area,
care.
and other folks too. So
Yeah, we welcome people from out of the area who want to attend, and we're doing this. We're starting our first Lincoln group next Tuesday on Zoom with a Zoom meeting. So we'll see what happens.
Is John O'Brien on? Does he want to say anything? I saw he was on.
Is John on?
Take care.
We're having Garrett Peck talk about his book about Lincoln and Walt Whitman.
Excellent.
Garrett, if you know Garrett, he's excellent.
All right. Thanks, Paul, for organizing the Zoom meeting.
All right. Kurt, John, everybody, Stan.
Everybody stay well.
All right. Yes.
Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Take care.